Hey YouTube, it's David here from Live Forever Die Trying, and today I have Raymond with me for our Past the Cover episode on Utopia for Realists. Raymond, would you like to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, so I previously started this segment with David past the cover where we go more in depth on books. I'm a software engineer. I also do some volunteering for Humanity Forward, which is related to universal basic income. So I'm also kind of involved in the discussion around that. So yeah, I was very interested in this book because it is one of the texts that argues for universal basic income and provides a different sort of argument style for it than many texts that we've seen before.
And obviously, you know me and this channel, so anything future related, whether that's technology or politics, I'm interested in. So this also hit a good place for me. Now, Rutger Bregman himself is a Dutch historian, which is very interesting. But in this book in particular, he's arguing for three key concepts. Of course, we include the universal basic income here, but we're also arguing for open borders and a 15-hour work week. Now, in the start of this book, he kind of sets the scene for us. He said, we're living in what he describes as a bleak paradise right now. And what he means by that is for most of measurable human history, the past 70,000 years, a majority of just humans have lived in extreme poverty where they didn't necessarily know if they were going to have food for more than a given period of time. Specifically, he brings up the stats that in 1820, 84% of the world's population was in extreme poverty. And then by 1991, that had dropped to 44%. And then today, we're at 10% within extreme poverty. So he's saying, kind of in a way, look how far we've come. But then he's setting this as the stage for arguing about utopian thought as a whole.
Right. So basically, Bregman is arguing that we have already surpassed as a society this level of poverty that we've claimed. And so he believes that we should allow ourselves to essentially slow down a little bit and not work these insanely long hours. This is a big focus of the book, is increasing leisure time and the 15-hour work week. He's arguing that because we can already have a society where very few people are in poverty, we can have this 15-hour work week because we are at the productivity level to allow everyone to be above this minimum threshold.
And that, I think, is the key thing behind this book as a whole. Of course, we'll break it down. But he's arguing we're now in a position that we can set sight for a new utopia. And one of the first key things he harps on within this new utopia is we've gotten so much more productive as a society. Our production of just food and other items that lead to a better quality of life has just exploded in the past 80 to 100 years. And we haven't necessarily set the next goalpost. The first goalpost that Bregman is talking about in this book is arguing for the 15-hour work week. He acknowledges that in the past we used to do backbreaking work and worked many more hours, and we've actually had to pass legislation that got us down to 40 hours in the first place. And he's arguing that more of the same can be good with our current society.
This is all part of the beginning portion of the book where he's trying to define utopia. And this 15-hour work week, he's arguing, increases leisure time, which is something that some studies have say lead to happiness. However, I think that there are problems with defining an overall society's well-being purely as a amount of leisure time basis. As we'll get into later on in the book, there are problems with the way that we currently measure a society's well-being, but I think that, leisure time is also problematic.
And I think that's one of the key things that we got hung up when reading this book together is if you're basing your society around leisure, is that going to be the most fulfilling goal to strive after, just being part of the human condition? A good parallel here is happiness and pleasure. you can game the system that is happiness just the same way you can game the system that is leisure. With happiness, if you just take a bunch of drugs, you will optimize for happiness, but that might not necessarily be what's best for you as a human. You might not have as high quality a life or be as fulfilled. So is leisure suffering from the same problem here? We see this in the pandemic as well as retirement. People are forced out of their jobs for a variety of reasons. They have an excess of leisure time, but we see rates of suicide and depression and anxiety skyrocketing right now. So is the external circumstances more important, or is just leisure not a great thing to optimize for in the first place?
Yes, those are some great points against Bregman's argument for leisure. I think some other important things to look at are how we measure happiness. So happiness, first of all, is not measured linearly. There's been plenty of studies, for example, by the famous psychologist Kahneman, that talk about how you more memorize the most extreme points of happiness or sadness in your life. And that more defines your bigger picture as opposed to how happy you are in the short term. And this leads to people getting much more happy when they set long-term goals and achieve them, as opposed to, for example, just kind of having day-to-day leisure time and not working toward this big picture idea.
So with that being said, critiquing leisure as the goal, I don't necessarily think it's a terrible thing. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if we can have the production to have the society and only work 15 hours a week, I don't think that's necessarily a terrible thing. I just don't think it's the optimal goal. But to talk more about the 15-hour work week specifically, currently we're capped at 40 hours. And if you work more than 40 hours, you get compensated, or the company gets penalized respectively by forcing to pay you additional wages or additional bonuses of some sort. So the idea here is that, we have gotten 3 times more productive in our history. Our output per hour of labor put in has become so much more efficient. Theoretically, we could take that 40-hour work week, drop it down to 15, and still maintain the same quality of life that we currently have, at least going by the statistics from the United States.
Right. And this is, again, another philosophical argument on what is utopia and what direction we should go in as a society. If you get 3 times more productive as a society, does that mean you should work 3 times less and be at the same productivity level you were at before? Or does it mean that you should work the same amount, 40 hours, and just produce 3 times more stuff as before? And this is just an open question. This is something that, how much progress should we make in society per amount of time? This is completely arbitrary. And he's arguing for, okay, given the productivity levels in society now, 15 is a much better set point than 40 is.
When we look at our real society, we see that obviously we are 3 times as productive, and obviously we're not working 1/3 of the time. So why are we in the situation that we are? And I think it's pretty obvious. It's because we're currently optimizing for productivity or increasing capital in our current economic system, because that's what we're prioritizing for, which is the almighty GDP. So the question is that what we should be doing? Is this thing that's forcing us to work these hours, do backbreaking work to become this more productive? It's a competition for resources, but is this what we should be striving for? Does this have a place within a theoretical utopian society?
It is optimal in this capitalistic system for people to work very high amounts. You see this in many salaried positions. Like, even though often people say 40 hours is full time, people are incentivized to work much over 40 hours per week because this produces the most capital for their company, and then they will be rewarded as such. But again, this is the idea of competition, is if some people are working 40 hours and they're using resources at this optimal rate, then more people should be working these 40 hours or more work periods, because they will lose in this competitive race for resources if they don't pursue that. So let's talk about, why are we optimizing for this arbitrary metric of GDP? That's Bregman's argument around this subject, is all of this overworking, all of this 40 hours stuff is centered around maximizing GDP. Why is this bad?
So GDP, the system we're currently under, it does optimize for certain things that do have some value, but I think it comes with a lot of negative effects and like baggage that come with it. So obviously, if we're optimizing for gross domestic production, is that the correct definition?
Yes.
So if we're optimizing for GDP,
I believe product actually, but
product.
Yes.
So if we're optimizing for that, I mean, we're going to try to optimize for the most output as a society. But however, that also carries the baggage of requiring an equal amount of consumption. So right now, side effects of GDP is like the perfect citizen under GDP is somebody who's going to have a lot of production, but also somebody with mental illness who's going to buy as many prescription drugs as they can get hooked on, as well as somebody that's paying for a divorce or committing crime or this assuming large amounts of debt and really taking on this additional risk, participating in the economy, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily making them a happy or fulfilled person in this process of getting hooked on those drugs, being depressed, going through expensive divorce proceedings, or, what have you. It's just not necessarily the best thing that we can optimize for.
GDP was meant to optimize for a more idealized resource use. And clearly, this can be loosely correlated with happiness. It clearly is not well correlated with happiness. It's not a good correlation. And to set some more examples, GDP has problems in that if I sell David one gold coin for $1, and then he sells me back the gold coin later, we have a GDP of 2. Let's say we each bought it for $1. We now have $2 of GDP. However, nothing has changed in the world. There has been no value that we've actually created despite having created some GDP from sales. The author actually recommends some other metrics that would improve things like, for example, you get more points for volunteering and having other metrics. However, all metrics can be gamed. For an example, if instead we are getting points for volunteering, you could still say, okay, if I shovel and turn a huge pile of dirt, dig out a huge pile of dirt out of the ground and make this hole and put it in this pile, and then I get some volunteer points, David can then shovel that pile of dirt back in the hole. And we both get volunteer points, but we have also not done anything. So regardless of what the metric is, it can be gamed. However, I think the author is trying to raise this point that GDP has this problem. The issue is that the author does not actually mention what is a better system for measuring the overall utility, the overall happiness of a group of people.
I will give him a little bit of credit, which he does mention that we should optimize for certain metrics. He doesn't give us an overall framework to optimize for, but he mentions like we can optimize for happiness or we can optimize to lower inequality. And he does this very vaguely. And I think it's something that should be like attempted, but he doesn't really have the answer nonetheless. So I do think it's important to try to give him a little bit of credit that he says this is what we should be going towards. And he really doesn't just have the perfect system thought out. And I don't think it's necessarily needed to have that system fully drafted at this point. But as long as we're going in the right direction, that's a positive. To talk a little bit more about GDP and the system that we exist under right now, however, he does bring up some very interesting points about the financial sector, really going as far as to call it almost a bullshit job, something that is siphoning value out of society without providing value. Now, Raymond, when you and I initially talked about this, we both kind of recoiled from this sentiment a little bit. And the more we thought about it, we kind of found more value that the financial sector does provide legitimate tools to society. And whether you are optimizing for GDP or not, I still think banking or finance as a whole has a place in a utopia. Would you agree?
Part of the reason why the financial sector exists is because we need to have the ability to get a loan to start a business. Even if you are a poet, you cannot make it on your own without the financial sector because you need a venue, you need a publisher, you need the press. And so essentially, regardless of who you are, you actually do require this institutional help. Now, the issue here is that the financial sector, you can say, is significantly over-rewarded for their actual contribution. So we're talking about, okay, these sectors do have theoretical value. However, because they're over-rewarded, that's why they become problems. The author uses the banking sector as a reason why capitalism is bad. But I actually think that is a little bit of an exaggeration.
I agree. Like, so for example, if I'm coming from a state where I don't have as much privilege as somebody, or maybe my parents don't have as much net worth, maybe I'm lacking certain opportunities, like going to college. However, if I need to go to college and I don't have access to these financial institutions, I'm shit out of luck. But if we do have the ability to take loans and get an education to further our life, access new opportunities, then I do think the financial sector inherently has value there. But going back to your point about, what is it really worth? I think that's something that we don't really have a good way to figure out at the moment. And that's kind of the problem, is because we do see things in the financial sector like swing traders, right? Like if you buy high and sell low, or GameStop tactics, but if you buy low, sell high, you're giving yourself value, you're making an economic gain, but have you provided anything to society? So I think what's more important here is not to label a full section of society bad as a whole, but get a little bit more specific about what we're trying to fix in the first place.
And, I think college attendance is a perfect example of, although we think that, it's so bad that people can profit off of someone that wants to go to college. For an example, you would need someone to give you a loan to even have this opportunity. I think another good example would be like venture capitalism. If it functioned ideally, Bill Gates would not be able to give anyone a personal computer if he had to start it with his own finances. So this is kind of the fundamentals of why these sectors are needed. But again, now we go over to other parts of the finance sector, and you look at like high frequency traders making huge profits. Is a modern day merchant deservedly, having access to these billions of dollars? I think many would argue that it's inappropriately allocated. So I think that, when we look at the sectors as a whole, this is not a good argument for, universal basic income, which is what this author is trying to wrap this entire section into, is the reason why we need to have a more equally distributed, and in fact completely equal with UBI, distributed income, is because we already have some areas in the capitalistic economy that are not well correlated with their actual value produced for society.
And one thing that this book differs from like Andrew Yang's UBI, which we'll link in our last Past the Cover episode, but he's not very specific with this particular UBI plan. And I think that's good and on purpose. So whereas Andrew Yang had an idea that he was going to run for president in 2020, he needed to work with the current US budget, the taxpayer system, and figure out what works right now. Speaking of UBI in this more philosophical way, of we have the system that is creating these problems with inequality, and we need a fair amount of redistribution of wealth. He's coming at UBI in a much more philosophical light here, arguing for it. Now, personally, of course, our opinions on it. I think we both agree that UBI is a good stopgap measure. But is this a system that fits within utopian thought as a whole?
I believe that he argues for UBI, and I think that's a good idea, but this is not argued in the right way. I don't believe that it's a good idea to argue that we need UBI because we have too many bankers, because we have too many lawyers, because there exist areas where capitalism, mishandles the amount of reward is not a good idea to argue for. This is why we need to actually discard the entire idea that people can be appropriately rewarded for the amount of value that they contribute.
And speaking or going off a play of words, areas of inequality, that's going to transition us into open borders, because that's the key thing he's kind of arguing in this third topic as well, is he's arguing for open borders because of inequality. Certain areas might be more resource heavy, and you might be fleeing, whether it is a civil war or fleeing just for better opportunities in general. Bregman here is arguing that borders are inherently, something that is keeping us from utopia. It's keeping people out through some fear or selfish reason. It's going to undermine our economy. But if you're fixing these other things, can you also have open borders and extend not only your nation's utopia ideals, but can you include everybody within that?
So I think Bregman gets some things correct in the premise. There have been studies that show that inequality leads to unhappiness, even for those that are on the rich side of the spectrum. As you increase inequality, the entire society's happiness goes down. Now, in order to get from there to open borders and having equal opportunity for all, that is the core of Bregman's message here, is having equal opportunity for all. I think there are additional problems. This chapter in the book, we both thought was not quite fully developed, in that, in theory, there are benefits of opportunity. However, they are not properly defended in the book, because the chapter on open borders was defended by saying, okay, here are a list of negative stereotypes about immigrants, and these are wrong. Therefore, we need open borders. And so the logic in this section was just not quite fluid enough to correctly argue for open borders.
And I think that's the key thing that we had the issue with, because in an idealistic utopian society where everybody is on an equal playing field and they do have enough resources just to subsist and do whatever they want with their life, in your theoretical utopia, you would have open borders. But in correlation to the other two chapters in this book, it feels like the first two chapters are more midterm, and this is more of a long-term goal. And you almost have a chicken and egg problem. So if we implemented open borders prior to doing something like UBI or 15-hour work week, would it not exacerbate our problems? So if the reason that we're doing UBI is something like automation or a lack of jobs that is naturally occurring, is allowing more immigrants going to help or hurt that problem? If the problem is already a lack of jobs in which we need a new economic system, you have to fix that before you allow the other solution. And I think that's really one point this book did not connect to the other two books. I still agree it's a utopian ideal, but I just don't know how it nests within the other concepts presented in this book.
Yeah, when we talk about the availability of opportunity, right? Let's first talk about that one. I am of the opinion that you will actually not have significantly increased opportunity when you have open borders, because there are tons of implementation problems. There are a variety of economists who believe that, GDP will increase. We looked at the economist Michael Clemens for an example. There are problems, though, with how you actually would implement open borders in a way that would make the entire society more prosperous. For an example, we already live in a world where Israel and Palestine cannot agree on the borders just between those two nations. How will we then have the entire world agree on an open border system for all? I think this would result in a required global governing system, a kind of global government. Because a country cannot exist unless you know who is inside it. And therefore, it would require very significant amounts of global cooperation to have this open border system. And I think that is a significant first difficulty in having this open border society.
And that's one of the key points, right? If we're marrying this idea of open borders with a strong social system like UBI, you in some way have to know who's paying into it and who you're paying in the first place. If you're coming to that country to be an immigrant, to benefit from something like a UBI, how do we keep track of that? And when every country is doing that with each other, what is your system? It almost requires a global governing body. And is that something that we want in the first place in order to make this ideal come true?
I think one can easily imagine how a global governing body would not provide equal opportunity. We already talk about, many countries will talk about how, the government that they have does not fairly give certain groups advantages that other groups have. But you can imagine that if we had a global governing system, there would still be significantly disadvantaged groups. And this is why governments exist for nations in the first place, is because people would like to have their values shared with the government that they have, instead of it being some overarching system that reaches down and determines what's best for them.
So all in all, I think we both agree that open borders is maybe has the less teeth out of all these ideas, but we still kind of like the idea. It just doesn't seem easily implementable. The other 2 points in this book, you be on 15-hour work week, I can get my head around. And overall, I did like the book, if for no other reason, that it encourages you to be future focused. Think about, if you don't like these 3 solutions, what 3 or what number of policies would you implement in your utopia? So personally, I came away from the book kind of appreciative more of the overarching philosophy, even if I found flaws in the 3 key topics themselves. What was your overall thoughts with the book?
While I think this book is interesting and that it encourages people to think about what the grand utopia is in the larger kind of historical and philosophical context, I would have to say I would not recommend this book, because while the intentions are good, I don't think that they're argued for correctly. The reason why we should have UBI should not be because we hate bankers. The reason why we should have the work week that we do have, whatever length it may be, should not be because what is this theoretical amount of poverty level that we had in 1820, and how does that correlate to today? I think that correlation is not good. And then lastly, while open borders is a theoretically good idea, I think that leaving the implementation out is strongly problematic. And, this is a system that is extremely unachievable with our current society.
Any other final thoughts before we close out?
No, I think that's all.
All right. If you do choose to pick up this book after Raymond's last recommendation there, I will leave those links in the comments below, or rather the description. And also, I'm going to link to Raymond's new channel himself, because he got his first video out the other week, a description of how the YouTube algorithm works and actually influences us. So go ahead, give him some support, drop a comment or 2 on his video, and let us know what you thought.
Thanks for the shout out, David. And thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. See you next time.
All right. Take care.